The Dreyfus affair was a political scandal that from its beginning in 1894 divided France until it was finally resolved in 1906. The affair is often seen as a modern and universal symbol of injustice, and remains one of the most striking examples of a complex miscarriage of justice, where a major role was played by the press and public opinion. The scandal began in December 1894, with the treason conviction of Captain Alfred Dreyfus, a young French artillery officer of Alsatian and Jewish descent, sentenced to life imprisonment for allegedly communicating French military secrets to the German embassy in Paris. Dreyfus was imprisoned on Devil's Island in French Guiana, where he spent nearly 5 years. Evidence came to light in 1896, primarily through an investigation instigated by Georges Picourt, head of counter-espionage, identifying a French army major named Ferdinand Walsin-Esterhazy as the real culprit. After high-ranking military officials suppressed the new evidence, a military court unanimously acquitted Esterhazy after a trial lasting only 2 days. The army then accused Dreyfus of additional charges based on falsified documents. Word of the military court's framing of Dreyfus and of an attempted cover-up began to spread, chiefly owing to J'accuse, a vehement open letter published in a Paris newspaper in January 1898 by famed writer Émile Zola. Activists put pressure on the government to reopen the case. In 1899, Dreyfus was returned to France for another trial. The intense political and judicial scandal that ensued divided French society between those who supported Dreyfus, such as Sarah Bernhardt, Anatole France, Henri Poincaré and Georges Clemenceau, and those who condemned him, such as Edouard Drumont, the director and publisher of the anti-Semitic newspaper La Libre Parole. The new trial resulted in another conviction and a 10-year sentence, but Dreyfus was given a pardon and set free. Eventually all the accusations against Dreyfus were demonstrated to be baseless. In 1906 Dreyfus was exonerated and reinstated as a major in the French army. He served during the whole of World War I, ending his service with the rank of lieutenant colonel. He died in 1935. The affair from 1894 to 1906 divided France deeply and lastingly into 2 opposing camps: the pro-army, mostly Catholic, anti-Dreyfusids, and the anti-clerical, pro-republican Dreyfusids. It embittered French politics and encouraged radicalization. The conviction was a miscarriage of justice based upon faulty espionage and blatant antisemitism, as well as a hatred of the German Empire following its annexation of Alsace and part of Lorraine in 1871. Summary. At the end of 1894, the French army captain Alfred Dreyfus, a graduate of the École Polytechnique and a Jew of Alsatian origin, was accused of handing secret documents to the Imperial German military, sentenced to prison for life for treason by a secret and closed trial, and deported to Devil's Island. At that time, the opinion of the French political class was unanimously unfavorable towards Dreyfus. Certain of the injustice of the sentence, the family of the captain, through his brother Mathieu, tried to prove his innocence, engaging at this time with the journalist Bernard Lazare. Meanwhile, Colonel Georges Picourt, head of counter-espionage, found evidence in March 1896 indicating that the real traitor was Major Ferdinand Walsin-Esterhazy. The General Staff, however, refused to reconsider its judgment and transferred Picourt to North Africa. In July 1897, to draw attention to the fragility of the evidence against Dreyfus, his family contacted the President of the Senate Auguste Scheurer-Kestner, who reported 3 months later that he was convinced of the innocence of Dreyfus and also persuaded Georges Clemenceau, a former MP and then a newspaper reporter. In the same month, Mathieu Dreyfus complained to the Ministry of War against Walsin-Esterhazy. While the circle of Dreyfusids widened, 2 almost simultaneous events gave, in January 1898, a national dimension to the case. Esterhazy was acquitted to the cheers of nationalists, afterwards shaving his moustache and fleeing France. and Émile Zola published his J'accuse, his Dreyfusard declaration, leading to the rallying of many intellectuals. A process of division of France began, which continued until the end of the century. Anti-Semitic riots erupted in more than 20 French cities. There were several deaths in Algiers. The Republic was shaken, with some even seeing it in peril, thus prompting a need to finish with the Dreyfus affair to restore calm. Despite the intrigues of the army to quell this case, the first judgment against Dreyfus was annulled by the Supreme Court after a thorough investigation, and a new court-martial was held at Rennes in 1899. Against all odds, Dreyfus was convicted again with 10 years at hard labor with extenuating circumstances. Exhausted by his deportation for 4 long years, Dreyfus accepted the presidential pardon granted by President Émile Loubet. It was only in 1906 that his innocence was officially recognized through a decision without recourse by the Supreme Court. Rehabilitated, Captain Dreyfus was reinstated in the army with the rank of major and participated in the First World War. He died in 1935. The implications of this case were numerous and affected all aspects of French public life. In politics, the affair established the triumph of the Third Republic, in the renewal of nationalism, in the military, in religion. It slowed the reform of French Catholicism and republican integration of Catholics, and in social, legal, press, diplomatic and cultural life. It was during the affair that the term intellectual was coined. The affair engendered numerous anti-Semitic demonstrations, which in turn affected the emotions within the Jewish communities of Central and Western Europe. These demonstrations had an impact on the international movement of Zionism by persuading one of its founding fathers, Theodor Herzl, that the Jews must remove themselves and found their own state. Terminology: the terms Dreyfusids, Dreyfusians, and Dreyfusists have different meanings. The Dreyfusids were the first defenders of Dreyfus, those who supported him from the outset. The term Dreyfusist refers to those who think beyond the case and see in it a necessity to question society, politics and, by extension, the operation of the Republic. As for Dreyfusians, they appeared only in December 1898. When the confrontation between anti-Dreyfusids and Dreyfusids became really acute and when the affair threatened the stability of the Republic, the Dreyfusians, although having some sympathies for Alfred Dreyfus, wanted to finalize the affair by calming it in order to save the Republican parliamentary regime then in place. They were the origin of some conciliation between the two sides through a mediation effort advocating appeasement. Their founding text was a call for unity, published on 23 January 1899 in the newspaper Le Temps. They generally supported the policy of Waldeck Rousseau and advocated secularization of society. Contexts: political. In 1894, the Third Republic was 24 years old. Although the May 16 crisis in 1877 had crippled the political influence of both the Bourbon and Orleanist royalists, its ministries continued to be short-lived as the country lurched from crisis to crisis. 3 immediately preceding the Dreyfus affair were the NICU of Georges Boulanger in 1889, the Panama Scandal in 1892, and the anarchist threat. The elections of 1893 were focused on the social question, and resulted in a Republican victory against the conservative right and the strength of the radicals and socialists. The opposition of the radicals and socialists resulted in a centrist government where political choices were oriented towards economic protectionism, a certain indifference to the social question, a willingness to break international isolation, the Russian alliance, and development of the empire. These politics of the center caused ministerial instability, with certain Republicans from the government sometimes aligning with the radicals and some Orleanists aligning with the Legitimists in 5 successive governments from 1893 to 1896. This governmental instability was reflected in an unstable presidency. President Sadi Carnot was assassinated on 24 June 1894. Then his moderate successor Jean-Casimir Perier resigned on 15 January 1895 and was replaced by Félix Fauré. Following the failure of the radical government of Élie Couthon-Bourgeois in 1896, the president appointed Jules Malines, who had been a supporter of protectionism under Jules Ferry. His government acknowledged the opposition of the left and some Republicans and always made certain of the support of the right. He sought to appease tensions in the religious, social, and economic sectors, and he conducted a fairly conservative policy. These policies achieved stability, and it was under this stable government that the Dreyfus affair actually broke out. Military background: the Dreyfus affair occurred within the context of the annexation of Alsace and Moselle by the Germans, an event that fed the most extreme nationalism. The dramatic defeat in 1870 seemed far away, but a vengeful spirit remained. Many players in the Dreyfus affair were also Alsatian. The military required considerable resources to prepare for the next conflict, and it is in this spirit that the Franco-Russian alliance, which some saw as against nature, of 27 August 1892 was signed as the basis of a military convention. The army had recovered from the defeat, but it still partly consisted of officers who were former senior aristocrats socially and who were politically monarchists. The cult of the flag and contempt for the parliamentary republic were two essential principles in the army of the time. The republic celebrated its army regularly, the army ignored the republic. Over the previous 10 years the army had experienced a significant shift in its twofold aim to democratize and modernize. The graduates of the École Polytechnique competed effectively with officers from the Royal Career Path of St. Cyr, which caused strife, bitterness, and jealousy among those junior officers who expected promotions of their choice. The period was also marked by an arms race that primarily affected artillery. There were improvements in heavy artillery, but also and especially the development of the ultra-secret 75mm gun. The operation of military counterintelligence, alias the statistics section, should be noted. Spying as a tool for secret war was a novelty as an organized activity in the late 19th century. The statistics section was created in 1871 but did not consist of more than a handful of officers and civilians. Its head in 1894 was Lieutenant Colonel Jean Sander, a graduate of St. Cyr, an Alsatian from Mulhouse, and a convinced anti-Semite. Its military mission was clear: to retrieve information about potential enemies of France and to feed them with false information. The statistics section was supported by the Secret Affairs of the Quai d'Orsay at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which was headed by a young diplomat, Maurice Paléologue. The arms race created an acute atmosphere of intrigue in French counter-espionage from 1890. One of the missions of the section was to spy on the German embassy at Rue de Lille in Paris to thwart any attempt to transmit important information to this opponent. This was especially critical since several cases of espionage had already hit the headlines of newspapers who were fond of sensationalism. Thus, in 1890 the archivist Boutonnet was convicted for selling plans of shells that used melinite. The German military attaché in Paris in 1894 was Count Maximilian von Schwarzkoppen, who developed a policy of infiltration, which appears to have been effective. Since early 1894, the statistics section investigated a traffic in master plans for Nice and the Meuse conducted by an officer that the Germans and Italians nicknamed Dubois. This is what led to the origins of the Dreyfus affair. The social context was marked by the rise of nationalism and of anti-Semitism. The growth of anti-Semitism, virulent since the publication of Jewish France by Edouard Drumont in 1886, went hand in hand with the rise of clericalism. Tensions were high in all strata of society, fueled by an influential press, who were virtually free to write and disseminate any information even if offensive or defamatory. Legal risks were limited if the target was a private person. Antisemitism did not spare the military, who practiced hidden discrimination with the famous Côte de Mort system of irrational grading, encountered by Dreyfus in his application to the Bourges School. However, while prejudices of this nature undoubtedly existed within the confines of the General Staff, the French army as a whole was an institution that was relatively open to individual talent. At the time of the Dreyfus affair, there were an estimated 300 Jewish officers in the army, of whom 10 were generals. The popularity of the duel using sword or small pistol, sometimes causing death, bore witness to the tensions of the period, when a series of press articles in La Libre Parole accused some brilliant Jewish officers of betraying their birth. The officers challenged the editors. So it was that Captain Cramufoa, a Jewish Alsatian graduated from the École Polytechnique, fought unsuccessfully against Drummond and against Mr. de Lamaze, who was the author of the articles. Captain Mayer, another Jewish officer, was killed by the Marquis de Moors, a friend of Drummond, in another duel, which triggered considerable emotion far beyond Jewish circles. Hatred of Jews was now public and violent, driven by a firebrand who demonized the Jewish presence in France. The Jewish presence in metropolitan France in 1895 was about 80,000 people, who were highly integrated into society. An additional 45,000 Jews lived in Algeria. The launch of La Libre Parole, with a circulation estimated at 200,000 copies in 1892, allowed Drummond to further expand his audience to a popular readership already enticed by the Boulangester adventure in the past. The antisemitism circulated by La Libre Parole, but also by Le Éclair, Le Petit Journal, La Patrie, L'Intransigeant, and La Croix, drew on antisemitic roots in certain Catholic circles.